But I do want to thank you guys for joining us this afternoon. This is the second in our 3-part series. So this week we're doing part 2. Next week we will be doing part 3 of this series. So if you came yesterday, this is the same session that we did yesterday. We'll do the same session yesterday, today, and Friday. And then on next week, or during next week, we'll do session 3. So make sure that you join us again next week during one of those 3 sessions for session 3. I always like to begin by just really thanking you for your work. Paraprofessionals are truly the lifeblood of this school. We know that you guys are doing some of the hardest work in the school each and every day. You're working with our most vulnerable students. You are really providing that support that allows these students to thrive. As I mentioned in that first session, my own son has special needs. He has autism. And without his paraprofessionals, he would not be able to thrive in school. They take such great care of him through the day, and they really just stop at nothing to ensure that he gets everything that he needs. So, I came across this quote: the paraprofessional is the heartfelt hero. They use their talents to help students discover their own. They dedicate their time and energy each day to the students in their care, and they do it all while meeting the individual needs of many. And that is just so true of the work that you guys do. So you really are school heroes, and we want to thank you for joining us today so that we can kind of grow a shared understanding of what are these best practices when it comes to providing literacy instruction to our students. As I mentioned, this is session 2. So today we're going to talk about supporting literacy in the classroom. As a paraprofessional or a support staff member of the community or the school community, we are all part of that classroom instructional team, right? So we're there to support the instructional needs of the students, the academic needs of the students. And so it's really important for us to understand these are the best practices now when it comes to literacy instruction. We know that some of the things that maybe we've done in the past, we no longer do. And then there are some new things that maybe we may want to try, particularly with those students who just need a little bit more time or a little bit more support, or what we might call scaffolding, to reach the goals that we've set for them. So today we're going to talk about what that can look like in the classroom and what your role is in providing that literacy support in your classroom. Now, as you remember, probably in our first session, we talked a little bit about Scarborough's reading rope. Now, this, is kind of almost looks like the DNA helix, the double helix or whatever, when we think about DNA. But this rope is a powerful tool for helping us to understand what happens as students become skilled readers, right? We know at the very beginning of our reading instruction, so when students really are not able to read, have no foundation in reading in kindergarten, pre-K, we look at this left part of the rope and we see that these strands are all kind of not intertwined. They're all separated, because at the earliest stages, we are teaching these skills largely in isolation from each other. Only as students become increasingly strategic and increasingly automatic with these skills will they be able to read to make sense of what they're reading, right? But we need to do the work of ensuring that they can kind of understand what is being read to them, so they can think deeply about texts that you read to them. They can communicate responses orally through read alouds and questioning and answering and read alouds. But they can also, as we look at these lower strands, these word recognition strands, they can read the words, right? As we mentioned in that earlier session, nearly 50% of our students across the state of Louisiana really get held up here. They get held up in these word recognition strands. They struggle to sound out the words and ultimately recognize the words by sight. And this is where many of our students need additional support. So if you're supporting 4th grade students and they're failing their tests, they're failing ELA, More often than not, what you're going to find is that the breakdown is here in these word recognition strains. Our students are what we call disfluent readers. They're not able to read with the fluency that they need to read to support comprehension of the texts that we're expecting them to read, right? We know that in order to read those texts, they have to read with sufficient rate, accuracy, and what we call prosody, which is reading expression. So it doesn't sound like a robot while they're reading. But very often what happens is as we move into the upper grades, we tend to kind of assume our students have these blue strands under control. We assume they are fluent readers, but you guys probably know more than anybody that our students are not, right? You're working with those students who are in the upper grades and maybe are still sounding out words, even though they're in the 6th grade. They haven't got to that place of automatic recognition. But here's the great thing. There are things that we can do to support that work. And you, in your capacity as a paraprofessional, can truly support this work. While the teacher is pulling small groups of students, you can also be working with students to set up that foundation in phonological and phonemic awareness to ensure that students are able to decode. They know the spelling and the spelling sound correspondences. They know that all of their letters make a particular sound. When we put 2 letters together, they might make unique sounds. They know all of these spelling rules. That helps them to decode words. And it's only through that process of decoding that they get to that place of sight recognition, where they're reading like you and I read. No longer are they sounding out words because those words have been mapped or imprinted on their brain such that they can recognize them by sight. That is how you and I read. We're not just super fast decoders. We actually do recognize these words by sight, but we've gotten there through this process of decoding. We spent time in our young lives sounding out words, and that's what prompted that shift, that imprinting on our brain that allows us to read the way that we now read. But many of our students get hung up here. They need additional instruction. If you think about our students now, many of these students lost a great bit of time during those K2 years when they're teaching reading foundations as a result of COVID, as a result of hurricanes, right? So our students have many, many gaps. We have to know what those gaps are. And you as a paraprofessional, if you know what students don't know, you can support them in that work. And these are things that you can do each day. But you might be asking, well, how do I know what they know or don't know? Well, there are many different ways. And in our next session, we're actually going to show you some resources that will help you pinpoint that. But today we're going to talk about what can you do when students do have gaps in these different areas. So just to kind of give some clarity to some of these concepts, when I talk about phonological and phonemic awareness, right? When we're working with students who need support with phonological or phonemic awareness, we're working to ensure that students can listen for and manipulate sounds in spoken words. So they're not looking at letters, they're not looking at text. This is all done orally and auditorily, right? So we often say when we're doing work with phonological or phonemic awareness, it can be done in the dark, right? We want our students to be proficient with these skills. So if I tell them, tell me the sounds that you hear in the word mat, they can go at automatically. They're not having to think about it for very long. Or if I say, put these sounds together and tell me what word you make, at, and they should be able to go mat. Students need to be very proficient with these skills if they're going to be successful decoders. Now, generally, this is the work of kindergarten. So if you're a paraprofessional in a pre-K or a kindergarten classroom, and you're doing work with phonological or phonemic awareness, you don't need to pull out the letter cards. You don't need markers. What you need to be able to do is to just tell students sounds, manipulate those sounds, and have them manipulate those sounds. What's great about work here is that if you're walking around the halls with your students, if you're walking to the cafeteria, if you're walking in line, and I hope I'm not breaking up. If I am, please let me know in the chat. But you can do this work there, right? As you're waiting for the restroom. Tell me the sounds you hear in the word dogs. Tell me the sounds that you hear in the word chop, right? Students can do those things while you are together. Okay, thank you guys for the messages here. My internet's just been a little unstable. Okay, so this is great work that you can do. Now, as I mentioned, this is typically the work of kindergarten, but we know that many of our students get held up here. So it's very possible you could have first or second grade or even beyond students who need support with phonological or phonemic awareness. And if you're doing that work, you just remember, no letters, no print, it's all about the sounds. These are the easiest ones to prepare for because you don't need anything except for your mouth and their ears and their mouths to do this work. When we talk about decoding, that's when we start layering on text, right? So this is when we're teaching students the sounds that letters make. We're teaching them spelling rules like CH says ch, TH says, or we're teaching them the magic E, right? And as we slowly and systematically introduce these spelling words, we're expecting our students to be able to read these words, right? And as we introduce these spelling patterns, they are going to sound them out. Now, years ago, we would say, oh no, we don't want our students sounding words out, but we now know that that is absolutely not what we need our students to be doing. We need them to be sounding the words out. We call that sounding out decoding. We need our students to decode because that is what prompts that shift in the brain. So you will see a lot of work with decoding in first, really towards the end of kindergarten. First grade is your big, what I often call your code building year. Second grade, you're still going to be introducing some code. And then throughout upper elementary, you're also going to be teaching some code as well. And as students learn this code, they read words with that code. They are able to read texts that only contain the sound spellings that they've learned. And ultimately, they get to this place of sight recognition. Now, I say this a lot, but I think it's really important to hear. When we think about our whole group curriculum, right? Our foundational skills curriculum that we teach in grades K through 2, you know, some of you might be using CKLA or ARC or Foundations. I think some of our districts use as well. When we think about that instruction or that curriculum, typically when we introduce a new sound spelling, students are given maybe 4 to 5 lessons to practice it, or 4 to 5 opportunities to practice it. Because the average reader, that's all it takes for them to get to that point of sight recognition. So if I teach them that AR says R, they need about 4 to 5 opportunities over time to apply that so that they're able to read that automatically by sight. Struggling readers, it might be 10 or 20 applications. Anticipate that, right? If you're working with a special needs population and they tend to struggle with literacy, anticipate that they're going to need more than what the whole group curriculum provides, right? So if you're working on AR with your students, they're going to need to be pulled to work on that. They're just going to need more time. They'll get it. It just takes them a little bit longer. Our dyslexic students can need over 100 applications before it's imprinted on their brain. And that's our goal, because once it's imprinted on their brain, then they're able to recognize that word by sight and read fluently. But if you as a paraprofessional understand that for some students, this work just takes longer and requires more than what is provided by their whole group curriculum, you're going to be able to support them. In our previous sessions, we talked about understanding that our teachers use a systematic scope and sequence for introducing all of these different, what we call sound spellings, or this code. Familiarize yourself with that sequence, because that's going to help you know what the students should know. So if you're working on CH says ch, but your students still don't know that A says ah, you know that you can go back and try to fill that gap, right? They need those letter sounds, because our goal is to get them to that place of sight recognition. And when I say sight recognition, I'm saying that students must read with that sufficient rate, accuracy, and expression or prosody to support comprehension of grade level text. This is not, and I want to be very clear, this is not sight words, right? Sight words we now know is not the most effective practice. So, you may have in the past worked, with the pull the Dolch list or the Fry word list, and you might send these home with students or review them with students. But our goal is not to get students to memorize words. Our goal is to encourage our students to decode words until they get to the point of sight recognition, and that will happen. Now, sometimes we may introduce tricky words like the, right? Maybe students don't necessarily in kindergarten don't have the code knowledge yet to decode the word the, but it's such a high leverage word that it really opens up a treasure trove of reading, right? Just being able to recognize the word the. But here's the cool thing about the word the. Spelling rules do apply to the word the, they just haven't learned them yet. So there are a few tricky words that we will sometimes teach in moderation, but just the old time way of like drilling hundreds of sight words, some of which are truly decodable or the skills have to decode. We don't do that any longer. We know that's not a best practice for our students. We know that decoding is where the work needs to be to get them to this place of sight recognition. Now, when we think about phonological or phonemic awareness, this is typically introduced in kindergarten and mastered by first grade. But like I told you guys before, students in higher grades often struggle with this and they may need support. Our English language learners often benefit from considerable support here. It helps them to hear the sounds in our words. So even if they're proficient decoders in their native language, that's wonderful. That ability to decode in their native language is going to support their ability to decode in English. But you still want to begin with having them hear and manipulate the sounds in English words. One other effect of that is it's going to support their pronunciation and support their language fluency, but it's also going to support their reading fluency to be able to hear those sounds and words such that when they encounter a word like hat, right? If you're a Spanish speaking student, A in Spanish says ah. So if they read the word, they might say hot, right? Now that's going to mean something very differently than if they knew that A in English says ah, and they had that opportunity to practice those phonemes, and then they can read the word as hat, right? So this is great work to do with our English language learners. Again, you're supporting students who simply in listening for the sounds, right? At the earliest stages, sometimes we just have students discriminate between maybe like a bell and a horn just to see if they can hear those differences. Then we have them identify the number of words in a sentence, clapping out syllables, rhyming, and then ultimately manipulating those individual sounds, those individual phonemes. Phoneme is a fancy word for sounds in words. These are all skills where your students may need support. And people will often ask me, well, like, how automatic should they be with it? They need to be very automatic with it. If I say, tell me the sounds you hear in Matt, they should not have to think too hard about that. If you say, tell me the sounds you hear in Matt, and your students do this, that's going to impact their ability to decode successfully, because then they're going to be those students who, when they encounter a word, they're going to go, rat, right? Make sure that they're proficient here. And don't worry about spending time here, because this is that foundation upon which all of these other skills build. And they have to be automatic with them. Phonics is what we talk about when we're talking about the work of decoding, right? These letter sound correspondences, we begin to introduce them in kindergarten. We teach them their letter sounds. More advanced spelling patterns like R-controlled vowels, diphthongs, schwa, things of that nature are introduced in grades 1 through 5. Now, if you have students who have been taught, say, R-controlled vowels, typically taught in first grade, and they're a third grader and they don't know R-controlled vowels, you have to back it up and teach it to them, because they're not just going to pick it up through osmosis. If you say, I'm going to teach you about R controlled vowels, AR says R, ER says IR says sometimes we call it the bossy R, they're going to be able to read much faster than if they were just trying to figure it out on their own, right? And again, your teachers are following a systematic sequence to introduce these sounds and spelling patterns. So, I say that because it's very important to understand this helps keep your work focused. As a paraprofessional, if you know what they should have learned, what sound spelling correspondences they should have learned by the point that you're currently at, and okay, we're working on digraphs, but this student really still doesn't know their basic letter sounds, you can concentrate your work there, right? You're not going to jump on to schwa, a much more advanced spelling pattern, right? If they don't know their basic letter sounds. So it helps keep you focused and ensures that all your students are getting what they need instead of just kind of this haphazard, oh, maybe I'll learn this here or that. So don't jump ahead. And if your teachers, I know that your teachers will be more than willing to make you a copy of the sequence that they teach these spelling patterns in. And that is so valuable for you to have. If you keep like a little folder with your materials, keep that in there, right? And that's going to help you know where you can support your students. And I feel like I sound like a broken record here, but sounding out words is an essential step towards reading fluency. We want to encourage our students to sound out words. Now, if they're proficient readers, no, they shouldn't be, because those words have been mapped on their brain. But as students are learning to read, we want them sounding it out. And I say this so passionately because for a long time, really, it wasn't the practice, but now it is. We want them sounding out, and that is the only way they're going to get to that point of sight recognition. Again, familiarize yourself with the progression of the code and just anticipate that some of these students are going to pick it up right away, right? Sometimes you might teach a spelling pattern and students get it the very first day, but some students are going to take much longer. And typically the students that you all are supporting are going to take a little bit longer, and that's okay. Anticipate that and be prepared to target your support. If I'm teaching R controlled vowels today, and I know that my 3 students tend to take a little bit longer than everyone else, I know that my work is going to be giving them multiple opportunities to practice reading words with R controlled vowels. R, car, jar, mar, all of these different things. And here's the great thing. The work doesn't have to be fancy, right? If a student doesn't know how to read words with long vowels, with that magic E sound spelling pattern, the most effective thing that you can do is give them opportunities to practice reading words containing that pattern. A little whiteboard and a word list, and you just practice that. Chaining, okay? I make the word mat. Now let's make it mate. Okay, let's change the first letter to R. Now what word do we have? That is called chaining, right? But that is a very effective strategy for helping students retain these spelling patterns. And you can do that with them easily with just a whiteboard and a dry erase marker. Other strategies, students can write the words. So you can say, okay, let's practice writing the word rate. Let's practice writing the word gate, right? We know that that practice of writing also supports students' ability to retain that information and map it on their brain. So these are things that you can do. Again, not fancy. I know oftentimes like we want to play games or do fun things like that, but what I find with those, particularly if you work with younger students, but really all students, is that the focus then turns to the rules of the game or the objective of the game, instead of keeping your work narrowly focused on the skill at hand, right? So we want our students to be able to not spend any cognitive energy thinking about the rule of the game or being stressed out about not knowing what they have to do. Keep it simple. We're going to practice reading words with particular sound spellings, and your energy for this work can make it fun. Okay, with chaining. Okay, now let's make it gate. Now let's make it rate. And just have that energy with your students. But the simplicity of that lesson keeps students' attention squarely focused on the work at hand, which means that your groups only have to be very, very brief, 3 to 5 minutes of that practice daily. But it also allows you to target your support. So if this student needs support with phonological or phonemic awareness, and this student needs support with letter sounds, you have time to meet with both of those students separately, as opposed to grouping them together and assuming that their needs are the same. Now, we talked a little bit about sight recognition. Sight recognition is just once they get to that point of being able to look at a word and read it. That is what our goal is. We want the students to be able to not have to think too much about what they're reading. They want that to be automatic, because only through that type of reading are they going to be able to make sense of what they're reading. As you're listening to students read, make notes about what you read to share with the teacher. So if you've taught R-controlled vowels and they're reading everything by sight, but when they get to a word with an R-controlled vowel, they stop to decode it, that's okay, right? So you can make notes about that, because they'll get to that point of being able to recognize that by sight. Now, if you're listening to students read and they're reading things incorrectly, stop them, provide feedback in the moment. For example, if they're confusing hat and hate, stop them and discuss the spelling rule. Hey, I noticed there's an E on the end of that word. What do you think that means now? Can you read that word for me now? Sometimes they just need that mental stop to help them reflect, and that's going to support them in retaining that. We also want to encourage them to make sure that when they're reading, what they're reading makes sense. If they're confusing hat and hate, there's probably not a situation where those words can be used interchangeably, right? So if they're confusing it, not only are they reading the word incorrectly, but it's made the sentence incorrect and has no meaning at this point. So we want our students there. Now, I like to end always with some reflection questions, and these are just for you to ponder. They're not for us to share out. But on your drive home, or when you're kind of in your classroom, maybe think, up to this point, how do you typically spend your time? So do you tend to focus more on behavioral management or classroom management or operations or instructional support? Our goal is that you can spend the majority of your time providing instructional support, right? We want our classrooms to become these well-oiled machines, where student behaviors are largely managed, but we don't want that to be your sole focus in the classroom. We truly want you there to support students instructionally. And what information do you need to provide solid instructional support? If you're working with a class of 20 first graders or 20 fifth graders, do you know what they don't know or they know? How can you be systematic in collecting that information or analyzing that information? Your teacher may be, your teacher probably does, if you're in grades K through 3, administer a screener. You can look at that to get information on what your students know and don't know. But say you have a student who doesn't know their letter sounds, you can make notes on a sticky note or on a sheet of loose leaf. Okay, I'm going to write down all my letters. Does he know J? Does he know K? Right? And then I'm going to target my work there. If he doesn't know J and K, but knows everything else, all I'm working on is J and K. Okay? So that's what we're going to do there. And then the last question is, what support do you need from the teacher in order to provide meaningful instructional support? We know that there just aren't gobs of time in your day to meet with the teacher. Your teacher is probably meeting during her planning period, and maybe you have other responsibilities during that time as well. We know that neither of you can typically come very early or stay late. And in fact, we don't want you doing that, right? We want you to get this work done in the context of this school day. But what are some strategies that you can use to get the information that you need from your teacher to provide that meaningful instructional support? Could be as simple as you know where the assessments are held, or you know where your teacher's note-taking binder is, and you go look at that, glance at that, because that's going to help you provide support. And you're going to start taking your own notes so that you know where you can provide support to your students. I'm going to conclude here today. If you have questions, please email us at louisianaliteracy@la.gov. Any ideas or feedback that you may have. In our next session, I'm going to take you guys on a tour of many different resources that we have that you can go directly to pull to support your students. So if you're like, okay, I'm an 8th grade teacher and I don't know what an R-controlled vowel is, I'm going to show you where you can get resources that'll support students with R-controlled vowels. And trust me, there's no shame in that, because if you put me in an 8th grade math classroom and you ask me to explain what a function is, I would have no clue, right? But we want to make sure that you know what these things are so that you can support your students. Again, I offer you my most sincere thanks for the work that you do every day. We appreciate all that you do, and we are here to help you. I hope you join us again next weekend, and please share with your colleagues that will be redoing this session on Friday. If they weren't able to make it, we'll also have the recordings posted in the literacy library. I'll stick around for a few minutes if anyone has any questions, but other than that, you are free to leave. Thank you so much for joining us.